Hey everyone, welcome to our next session on setup Kubernetes cluster locally. In the previous session, we have seen some theoretical part on the Kubernetes. We have seen on what is cluster node and worker node, and we have seen how Kubernetes API works, the summary of Kubernetes architecture, those theoretical part. Now, before going to practical sessions on the Kubernetes, one should know how to set up Kubernetes locally. So to play with the Kubernetes commands and to host your application locally as a local host, you need to understand how to set up Kubernetes in your local system. So there are different options we have to set up our playgrounds with the Kubernetes. How to set up a cluster in your local machine. So one is we have an option in the online where we can set up Kubernetes cluster. So just to play with the Kubernetes commands, that will be giving like 4 hours time to play with some commands and all. So then we have second option, hosted Kubernetes. So how hosted Kubernetes means, already we might be knowing like how to set up Azure environment, and that is AWS. AWS provides Elastic Kubernetes services and or AKS. Using an AKS also we can write the commands and all, we can set up our cluster. So directly we will be writing the commands in Azure cloud provider. And another one, GKE, that is nothing but Google Kubernetes engine. So this is the second option, hosted Kubernetes. But as we are going to try commands in our local machine itself without spending money and without doing with uh, free trial and all, we are going with other option, that is a Docker desktop. So first thing, this a Docker desktop is a tool which will help us to write, build your images, create a containers, deploy to the Docker hub, and you can also create Docker desktop. Also it will provide Kubernetes cluster. So by using this we can write Kubernetes containers handle, we can create, and we can play with Kubernetes. So the first option, play with Kubernetes. So you can go to the URL with a play with Kubernetes. So once you can open the first link, play with Kubernetes option, KTS background. So this will give you a simple interactive and fun playground to start with the Kubernetes. You can click on start. So it will ask you to log in with your Docker credentials or some Docker credential or GitHub credentials. Using the GitHub credentials, you can log in. So the session will be open. So this session, it is available for 4 hours. So after 4 hours, you can't use this session. So this is the one of the option to use the Kubernetes. So using this playground, you can use your Kubernetes cluster and you can write the commands. And second option, what we have is using Azure Kubernetes services or AWS Kubernetes services, that is Elastic Kubernetes services, which is provided by the AWS. And third one is we have an option for Google Kubernetes engine. And this third option, we have installing the Docker desktop in your local machine. That is the best way to write Kubernetes cluster, and that will provide you the development cluster node. So how to install the Docker desktop? You can go to the URL, install Docker desktop on Windows. You can go to this URL. This will give you the documentation of how to install the Docker desktop and release information, pre-release informations, and system requirements, prerequisites, whatever the prerequisites are there, that information that this document it will provide. So you can click on Docker desktop for Windows. It will download you the package. Once you click, it will give you an exe file. So you can run the txt file that will be available under the downloads. You can just click on this installer and you can install the Docker desktop. Once the Docker desktop is installed, you can open the Docker desktop. You can search in the Docker desktop with the name in the Windows menu option. You will get the Docker desktop option. Open the Docker desktop. So let Docker desktop is running in the background. It is not yet open the Docker desktop. Let it open. So before that, if you write any Docker command, it will if the Docker desktop is not running at the background, it will not show any information. That means Docker command itself it won't work. So if the Docker ps when you give the Docker command, this is one of the command so which will display all the Docker image information, all Docker container information. So that command is working because Docker desktop is running backend. If you see Docker desktop is running, if the Docker desktop is not running, your Docker command itself commands will not be working. So Docker desktop is running. Let us open the Docker desktop here. So Docker desktop is already installed and it is running in the background. So Docker desktop is running. If the Docker, when you open the Windows, if it is not opened, you can go here and you can check here. Docker desktop is running. You can double click on that. That will open the Docker desktop window. And if you see here, Docker engine also it is running. That's why you are able to run the Docker command here. And also Kubernetes also it is running. So whenever you are installing the Docker desktop, by default Kubernetes will be disabled. If you want to enable, you can go here and you can enable the. You can go to the settings. Here you have an option of settings, option setting. You can go here and you can enable the Kubernetes service. So once you enable the Kubernetes, so you should be able to write the commands of Kubernetes, and you should be able to do the create pods, deployments, everything in your Docker desktop in your local machine. So now let us try to see whether your Kubernetes service is working or not. The command which we use to run the Kubernetes service, the Kubernetes command, that is a kubectl. What is kubectl here? The kubectl is, it's a command line tool. Kubectl, it is a Kubernetes command line tool for Kubernetes management. So whenever if you want to write any commands to communicate with the Kubernetes cluster, kubectl it's a command line tool. It will be helpful us to write the commands. So whatever we are sending a request via command, that will reach to our Kubernetes cluster. So what Docker desktop is doing, it is a single node cluster. So when you install the Docker desktop, it will create a single node cluster. So only one node will be available just for the practice or for your localhost commands. So what is the command for, if you see, if you want to get the node information, kubectl get nodes. So we'll see how many nodes are installed, how many nodes are there. There is only one node. What is the node name? Docker desktop node. So why kubectl get nodes it is giving only one? Because this node got created whenever you enable the Kubernetes in Docker desktop. So you will, this is one cluster got created. It's a single node cluster. So get nodes. So kubectl get pods. We'll see any pods are available in a Kubernetes. There is one pod is running, that is Angular pod. It's created. This is one pod because which earlier I created one pod, that is showing one pod is created. Only one pod is there. And there is another command which will give you the config file, kubectl config space view. So this command it will give you the configuration file. So what is this kubectl config file? See, whenever we are writing the commands in a command prompt, the request has to reach to the Kubernetes cluster. How it will reach? To reach, there should be some authentication and authorization, and some URL should be there, and it should reach to Kubernetes cluster. There is some information should be there. So from where that information will be getting? So whenever you install the Docker desktop and once you enable the Kubernetes, there will be one file will get created in your local machine. Where that file is there, you can go to your C folder. So inside C folder, users, and your username, and there is a one folder got created, hidden folder, the .kube folder. So here if you see, there is a config file. So if you edit that config file using a you can open that file, open with your Visual Studio Code. So if you just see that what is the file, so this is the uh, config file. Okay, so config file which is already automatically it is created when you install the Kubernetes cluster. So what this file it says, it's an API version, and see, I already explained, whenever you enable the Kubernetes cluster using the Docker desktop, it creates a single cluster. So this is a single cluster information. So this cluster, what is this certificate authority data, and this is the server it will use, API server, and what is the name? It's a Docker desktop, and it's a context. There are three parts will be there with this config file. One is cluster, second one is clusters, and third one is users. You can create multiple users. You can also create a multiple context. So which context we are using to run the Kubernetes commands? We are using Docker desktop context. You can create one more context like this, right? So what is the kind, which type of file it is? It's a config file. That's why we are mentioning kind means what type of file it is. It's a config file. So user, Docker desktop user. So whenever which user we are using to log into our cluster and to write the command, Docker desktop user we are using. So how we are using to communicate that? We have the URL here in the config file. We have the client certificate data, client key data. All this information is available under the config file. So with this, so what kubectl will do, whenever you are using the command kubectl command, this kubectl, what it will do, it will use this JSON file, this config file, to communicate with your Kubernetes cluster. Which cluster? This cluster. This is the cluster, and this the server. So to communicate with this server, that all the information, the required information, login information and URL information, API and certificate information, everything it will be there under this config file. So it will be there under this config file. kubectl will use this config file. So what is the version of kubectl we are using? You can check the version. This is v1.30.5. This kubectl file installed. Whenever you are installing the enable the Kubernetes in the Docker desktop, once you enable it. So usually this config file will be there when whenever you are using the command line tool. It will use this config file. So this config file we will also call it as kubeconfig file. So we know how to get the information: kubectl get nodes, kubectl get pods, and config view. So kubectl version. So going forward, we will use this kubectl. We will be using kubectl to communicate with our Kubernetes cluster. There is another command we have, kubectl explain pod. See, if you don't know any some information, you can ask to the kubectl. It will just give you the information. For example, I am asking Kubernetes to explain me the pod. So that will give information regarding the pod. How it will give, what is the kind, it's a pod, version. You need to give description, fields, so metadata information, spec information, state, how to create a pod. If you can use this template to create a pod. So those information also we will get it using the kubectl command. So that's all about this session. In the upcoming session, we will create one Angular application, and with that Angular application, we will make it containerized, and we will create a pod with this containerized application. If you have any doubts, feel free to post it in the comment section. Thank you.